Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the 11, and those joining us online, welcome to you as well. For those of you just joining us, we are in a teaching series, and we're going through the book of Philippians. And if you brought a Bible this morning, I want to encourage you to pull that out. I think last week I talked about how it would be so great if we all took on this practice just for this teaching series of actually bringing a paper Bible to the Sunday gatherings. And the purpose of that is that there's just something really more meaningful about having a paper text in front of you, especially if it's your own text. And we want, through this series, to be able to live in the text and have the text live inside of us. So we were just encouraging, bring a Bible along. But if you're here this morning and if you want an actual paper Bible, put up your hand, and one of our elders, we got stacks of them all over the place. We would be happy to deliver one to you wherever you are. Fast food Bibles are ready to go. So if you're looking for one, we've got a team that love to put those in your hands. Technology. I want to start by showing you some pictures this morning. And I wonder if you can, as we show the pictures, if you can recognize who these people are. And I want you to pay attention because I think there's something that each of them has in common. So let's look at this first picture. I wonder if you can recognize this person. Yeah, this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is his famous I Have a Dream speech after the Million Man March on Washington. Let's look at this next one. That is Winston Churchill. And, of course, he was the Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. He refused to surrender to Nazi Germany, even though Nazi Germany is dropping bombs on his country and on his people. But he had his famous speech, "We shall never surrender. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the shore." Anyway, I love Winston Churchill. But that's Winston Churchill. Next one. This is Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi was doing his famous Salt March protest. He was standing up to British colonialism for his mother country of India. Who's this next guy? A lot of people call him the Tank Man, but no, people don't really know who he was. So in 1989, the tanks were marching into Tiananmen Square, and you don't even see all of them here, but there were like 19 tanks coming down this highway, and he was the lone person who went out and he stood in front of the tanks. And it's interesting that the tank tried to move, and he'd move in front of the tank, and the tank would move, and he'd move in front of the tank, and eventually he actually climbed on top of the tank, and he started speaking inside to the tank drivers. Now eventually the authorities grabbed them and pulled them out of the way, and the tanks rolled in. But that's Tank Man. Let's look at this one. That's Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks refused to be segregated. She chose to sit in the white-onlys section of this bus, and of course, she was part of sparking this movement in the Civil Rights Revolution in the United States. These people shared one common attribute, and I bet you can guess what it is. It's courage. They acted courageously. But not only did they act courageously, they also spoke courageously. In fact, they're among the few who were willing to speak up when all other people remained silent. Now, I don't know about you, but I get really inspired by people of courage. I love to hear their stories because it encourages me to be just a little bit more brave, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in really, really big ways. And I wonder this morning if some of you might need a dose of courage. Because here's the reality, is we all face fears in some ways. Sometimes small, sometimes big fears. I mean, we fear not fitting in. Some of you maybe fear being found out. We fear Corona and Ebola and the Macarena. Those dancers terrify me. I mean, we fear inflation and taxes or unemployment, sickness or death, failure. Some of you fear success. Some of you fear growing up, living on your own, paying your own bills. Some of you fear growing old, living with your kids and paying for their mortgage, right? We fear sharks and spiders and clowns. You know, the thing about being human is to be human is to fear. And I think every one of us at some point can use a little dose of courage. Now, I've discovered that a common fear that most believers in Christ share is speaking about Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes an opportunity comes, God opens a door or a window or whatever, right? And there's this opportunity for me to just tell about awesome Jesus, right? And it's like the world just goes into slow motion. I'm like a deer staring into the headlights of an approaching freight train, and my hands get clammy, my spit gets pasty. It's like there's this peanut butter hairball that get lodged in the back of my throat. And I mean, I have the most wonderful, life-changing news on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't seem to get it out. Because, I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing, or maybe I'll say it in the wrong way, or maybe I'll offend somebody, or maybe it's going to somehow disrupt or wreck the relationship I have with this person. And so I have all of these thoughts and all of these fears just roaming around in my head, and I just am afraid to speak. I wonder, have you ever felt that way before? Have you ever been in that situation before? Well, the good news is you're not alone. As it turns out, people have been feeling this way for thousands of years. And this morning, we're going to discover that there are other people who needed help speaking Jesus courageously. So that's our topic this morning. And so we're going to do a deep dive into the text, and as we walk through the text, you're going to discover that this is true. And I want us to start in Philippians chapter 1, start at verse 12. We're just going to walk our way through the text a little bit at a time. Here's what is written. I'll read it for you. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Now, you'll remember that this is the book of Philippians, and the Philippians is written by none other than the Apostle Paul. And he's writing a letter to a church that's from the city of Philippi, and it's, over 2,000 years ago. And the first thing that we pick up in the text is that something has happened. And the question is, what is Paul talking about? Well, it's important that we recap the backstory of what's going on here. Paul is under house arrest in Rome. So he's locked up in a house. He's chained by his ankle to the floor. He cannot leave. Outside the door of his house are stationed 2 Roman guards, and they're watching over Paul. Paul can have visitors. He can have people come in, bring him supplies, or spend some time with him, but he cannot leave. And Paul is facing trial. In Rome, you only got locked up if there's a pending trial. There was no long-term imprisonments in Rome. You were locked up, and then your trial came. So Paul's waiting for a trial to come. Now, you notice in the text that Paul says that his imprisonment is for Christ. And he'll say later on in verse 16, we'll discover that he says, I was put here for the defense of the gospel. So the truth is that Paul is here in prison for speaking Jesus courageously. In fact, this is how Paul got to Rome. I don't know if you know the story, but this all began when Paul was visiting Jerusalem just a few years prior to this. And when he was in Jerusalem, there were many people who opposed Paul and opposed the gospel from among his own countrymen, his own Jewish countrymen. And so in this opposition, they saw that this new movement was a threat to the religious establishment. And so some of them decided that they were going to make some false accusations against Paul. They had actually said that Paul had brought Gentiles into the temple, which in that day was a big no-no because Gentiles who were unclean would have defiled the temple. So people got pretty upset about this. Tempers flared. A mob started to form. They eventually dragged Paul into the street and started beating him. Well, the local Roman garrison that was there, the tribune who was in charge of the garrison, saw this and said, this isn't a very good idea. And so he intervened. And he got his soldiers to go in and to rescue Paul. And it says in the text that they literally had to pick Paul up and carry him out, like all of these soldiers from the mob, because they were trying to tear Paul to pieces. Well, they got Paul back to the steps of the barracks. And when they got to the steps, Paul says, hey, by the way, I'd love to be able to speak to the crowd. Could I speak to the crowd? And they said, okay, yeah, you can speak to the crowd. So what did Paul do? He spoke Jesus courageously to the crowd. And that wasn't a good idea because the crowd just flipped out, got even more crazier. And so the Roman soldiers took Paul and they locked him in the barracks. Then it was discovered that people wanted to assassinate Paul. There was a plot to assassinate Paul. So they got Paul out of Jerusalem and they shipped him off to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was the capital city of that region, and that's where the governor's palace actually was. And the governor at that time, his name was Felix. And so Paul came before Felix, and Felix wanted to hear all about the case, and so he began to question Paul. And of course, what did Paul do? He spoke Jesus courageously. And he told them all about what was going to happen. So Felix locked Paul up in Caesarea. As a matter of fact, Paul stayed in Caesarea for 2 whole years, locked up, waiting for trial. Why did he do that? Well, Felix was hoping that Paul would pay him a bribe to get him out of prison. But of course, Paul would have none of that. And so Paul stayed locked up for 2 years in Caesarea. Time went on. And as time went on, Felix got replaced. another governor came into Caesarea. That governor's name was Festus. Festus wanted to know what's up with Paul. So he had Paul appear before him. What did Paul do? Paul spoke Jesus courageously. And of course, Festus, he's the new governor. He wants to gain some sort of favor with Jerusalem. He wants to gain points with them. So he had it in mind, I'm not going to try Paul. Instead, I'm going to send him back to Jerusalem, and he's going to be tried there. What do you think would happen if Paul went back to Jerusalem? It would have been a kangaroo court. This would be like throwing him to the lions. He would have lost his life if he went back to Jerusalem. And so Paul did what only Paul could do in that situation, to rescue himself, but also to get him to Rome. Paul appealed to Caesar. See, what's interesting about Paul is he grew up in Tarsus. It was a Roman city. And because he grew up in Tarsus and he came from a certain family, Paul was a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, it was Paul's right to appeal to Caesar, which means that instead of having to stand trial in Caesarea, they could take Paul and they would ship him all the way to Rome, to Caesar's court. And he would stand before the magistrates in Caesar's court, or maybe even perhaps to Caesar himself, which would be really great for Paul, because what could Paul do then? Speak Jesus courageously. Well, the only problem was that Festus didn't exactly know what the charges were against Paul. As a matter of fact, there didn't seem to be any charges that would stick. He had to come up with charges because that was important, because those charges would go ahead of him when Paul arrived. That's what he would be charged for. So some other dignitaries, King Agrippa and his wife Bernice, came to visit Festus in his palace. And Festus is wrestling with this problem. And so he says to these dignitaries, okay, I got this case. I got this guy named Paul. And I don't know what to do with him. And I don't know what charges to bring up on him. Could you listen to Paul? Could you talk to him and hear his case? And so they did. And Paul appeared before King Agrippa and Bernice. And guess what Paul did? You got it. He spoke Jesus courageously. But at the end of that, here's what they determined. They said, you know what? I have no idea why he appealed to Caesar. There were no charges that could be laid against him. He could have gotten off. He could have been let go if he didn't appeal to Caesar. But Paul appealed to Caesar, and so to Caesar he went. And it's an amazing journey. I mean, you got to read about it. It's Acts chapter 21 to 28. A large portion of the book of Acts tells this whole journey. I mean, there's a shipwreck. There's all these things that are happening. And all along the way, as Paul's finding his way from Caesarea to Rome, what is he doing? He's speaking Jesus courageously. And finally, at the end of it all, he finds himself in Rome. And here we find him today in the text. Now, the most fascinating thing about Paul's journey to Rome is that it was no accident. As it turns out, Rome is exactly where Jesus wanted Paul to be. Paul wasn't in prison for the emperor. Paul was in prison for Christ. See, there's this interesting detail in the book of Acts, chapter 21. Paul's locked up. Remember, he's back in Jerusalem. He's locked up there. I mean, he hasn't even gotten to Caesarea yet. He's still in the barracks in Jerusalem. And as he's locked up in Jerusalem, Jesus appears to Paul and he speaks to him. And here's what we find in Acts chapter 21. Here's what it says. The following night, the Lord stood by him and he said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." What this means is that Jesus was working behind the scenes. He's pulling the strings to send Paul to Rome. And Paul, following Jesus in glad obedience, was willing to go, even if it meant suffering. So when Paul says, "I am a prisoner for Christ," there is perhaps a double meaning in what he's saying here in the text. Now, even though Paul was in prison, I mean, even though he's experiencing this hardship and this suffering and all this opposition, Paul saw this as a win. I mean, we hear that in the text. Here's the thing. God can take a really bad situation and he can turn it into good. God can redeem our suffering no matter what our suffering is. You might be here today and you might be wondering, what is the point? What is the meaning of our suffering? God can somehow take our suffering and bring meaning to it. And the positive outcome that Paul saw in his suffering was God was advancing the gospel. In fact, the gospel was advancing so strongly that it was impacting the imperial guard. Well, who's the imperial guard? Well, the Greek word there is the praetorium. The praetorium were Caesar's personal army that were garrisoned and stationed in Rome. It was his special ops security force, and there were thousands of them. And many of them would have stood for 4-hour shifts outside of Paul's door. Can you imagine being a Roman guard standing outside Paul's door for 4 hours? What do you think Paul was doing? Speaking Jesus courageously. And of course, they would have also overheard his conversations with visitors. They'd have been watching his way of life. They would have been noting the fact that this guy's locked up and he's happy. I mean, this is the strangest thing. And afterwards, they would have gone back home and they would have told their families and they would have told other people about it. And soon enough, the good news, the gospel, is beginning to spread. The gospel was advancing through Rome like an army. But it didn't stop there. Let's keep reading. Verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So as a result, other people began to speak Jesus courageously. I mean, and the question is, well, where did this boldness come from? Well, it came from Paul's chains, and it came from God's activity. Because when they'd heard what the Lord was doing through Paul and in Paul, their eyes automatically just turned upwards. They turned their eyes towards the Lord. And here's the thing, you can lock up Paul, but you can't lock up the gospel. And then Paul's boldness just began to inspire their boldness. Now, the church at that time had every reason to be afraid. Okay, because when you consider who the Roman emperor was at this time in history, you would have been terrified. That Roman Empire at this time, the Caesar, was none other than Nero himself. Nero was an insecure, insane tyrant. I mean, he was a real piece of work. He came into power when he was only 16 years of age. And after that, he had his wife murdered. He had his mother murdered. He had members of the governors murdered, right? So he basically governed, he ruled, he dominated just through sheer terror. Nobody would stand up to Nero. And Nero would eventually become the first Roman leader who was the persecutor of the church. Now, prior to that, the Jews had already been persecuting the church, okay? So persecution wasn't foreign to the Christian church. But this was the first time that the Gentiles, the empire, had begun to persecute the church. See, in AD 64, something happened. A great fire broke out in the city of Rome. And this fire burned in the city of Rome for 9 days. And it wiped out about 1/4 of the entire city of Rome. And many speculate that Nero had started the fire himself. That Nero kind of wanted to wipe out that part of the city because he wanted to create a palace. He wanted to develop a whole new area of the city. So Nero started the fire, but he needed a scapegoat. And his scapegoat were the Christians. And he blamed the fire on the Christians. And so after the fire, this gave Nero every reason to begin persecuting Christians. There's one ancient writer who reported that on his worst days, Nero would crucify Christians, he would dip them in oil, and he would light them on fire at night so that he could host his garden parties and his races around his palace. This is the kind of man that Nero was, and this is the way that he treated Christians. So Paul was writing Philippians only a couple of years, maybe a few years, prior to the burning of Rome. So this is the tension that's happening. Rome's attitude towards Christians, though, didn't happen overnight. This was a tension that was just building over time. See, in the beginning, Rome was very tolerant of Christianity. And the reason why they were tolerant of Christianity is they assumed that Christianity was just a sect of Judaism. And Judaism was a licensed religion in Rome. You see, in Rome, all non-Roman religions actually had to get permission from the government to exist. They had to get a license. And as long as they didn't interfere with the peace, or as long as they didn't corrupt the morals of society, those religions were allowed to exist. But then, something happened. The Jews began persecuting Christians. And this Christian movement began to spread and began to grow. And so as a result of that, the difference between Judaism and Christianity became more obvious. And so the Roman authorities started to take notice. But in society, there was also a growing dislike of Christians through the Roman Empire. I mean, these Christians were a different kind of people. I mean, they had strange practices like communion, and they prayed to an invisible God, and they did these love feasts, right? And not only that, these Christians refused to worship false gods, which was really, really difficult in an empire filled with idols. I mean, idols were everywhere. If you went into somebody's house, there was an idol there, and you had to honor that idol before you went into the house. If you went to a person's place of business, you had to bow down to the idols before you went into the place of business. And Christians were refusing to worship idols, which was creating a lot of tension. But the biggest source of tension was the imperial cult. Christians refused to worship in the imperial cult. What was the imperial cult? Well, the Romans at that time had started to treat their emperors as gods, their dead emperors, and they began to worship their dead emperors. And some of the living emperors were starting to treat themselves with a sort of godlike status. And of course, Nero, crazy and insecure Nero, was one of those people. You can find a lot of different evidences of this in history. But there's this one inscription that said it all. Nero called himself the Lord of the whole world. So I want you to imagine this. Imagine being back then. And you're the emperor. And you hear that there's this religion out there, this unlicensed religion out there in the empire. And it's kind of growing, and it's getting traction. And this religion claims that its leader is the resurrected Son of God. And that he has his own kingdom. And that his kingdom is growing and it's forcefully advancing. As a matter of fact, he calls himself the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And one day his kingdom is going to return, and it's going to bring justice to the earth, and it's going to wipe out everything and make all things new, bringing justice to the earth, fixing everything. How do you think an insecure, mad emperor would respond to that news? So this is the time when Philippians was written. And this is what Paul was at when he was locked up in Rome. Now, I imagine some Christ followers would probably have been saying, we need to keep it down. Let's kind of lay low a little bit. Right? Let's not rock the boat here in Rome. But they weren't the only ones. And yet, in spite of this growing pressure to fit in, to be silent, what was Paul doing and what was the church doing? Speaking Jesus courageously. Let's keep reading. Paul says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel, but the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to affect me in my imprisonment. So what it turns out is that not everybody's actually in Paul's fan club, right? There are some people that really, really loved him. There were some people that really, really envied him. And we don't know who Paul's rivals were. What we do know is that there were people who were jealous of Paul. But you need to think about this. I mean, before Paul, there weren't any apostles in Rome. There had never been an apostle in Rome. So basically, people had become Christ followers there because news had spread, or other Christ followers had moved to Rome, and the gospel began to take root, and the church there began to grow. That's how it began there. An apostle didn't go out and send it. But then suddenly, Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles? I mean, come on. He shows up. He's in prison. He's got all this backstory, right? People are like starry-eyed about Paul the apostle. If you were some sort of a leader in that church at that time, you maybe perhaps felt a little bit threatened. It may have been intruding on your popularity or intruding on your power. And so they thought maybe that by speaking Jesus courageously, it might just kind of stir things up in Rome. You know, people's dislike of Christ's followers that was already there would maybe start to get even a little bit worse, and they might actually blame Paul, and maybe perhaps Rome would do the dirty work for them. Which is mind-blowing when you think about it, isn't it? I mean, I can't imagine this sort of thing ever happening in the church in our time. We are far too sophisticated. You know, I got to imagine, if I was Paul, I'd be choked. I'd be ripped off. I'd be ticked. I might be hurt. I might feel a little bit threatened. I want to give up. I want to write some letters, fast and furious, to those people in the church there. But how did Paul respond? Well, let's read verse 18. What then? So he's saying, so what? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that, I rejoice. What's Paul's response? Joy. You know what? This theme is just going to keep popping up again and again in Philippians. And it should continue to surprise us, right? Because remember, Paul's chained to the floor. He's locked in a house. He's half starving. He's a world away from the people he cares about, right? He's facing potential death. And yet here he is in prison and he's rejoicing. Rejoicing. But now the reason that he's rejoicing in this instance is that people are speaking Jesus courageously. So it doesn't matter why they're doing it. All that matters is what they're doing. And why is Paul so happy? Because this is his life's work. And this is what Jesus called Paul to do. This is what Jesus rescued Paul from his former way of life to do. He made him the apostle of the Gentiles. And Paul had written letters to Rome before. In his letter to the Romans, chapter 15, he talks about this. He says, it's always been my desire to go to Rome. He's always wanted to go there. And now here he was locked up in prison in Rome. He got a free ride, and the gospel of Jesus is advancing. It's spreading. And so his prison cell became a cathedral. It became a place of praise. It became a house of worship. Well, what do we learn today about speaking Jesus courageously? You know, as I dug in the text together, dug in the text myself, I came up with 3 discoveries as I was in there. Here's the first one. Speaking Jesus courageously could lead to suffering. You know, there's a general belief in our culture today, and goes something like this, is that all religions are essentially the same. All religions are equally true or valid. There's a term for that. It's called religious pluralism or ideological pluralism. Basically, all religions are. There's no difference between all the religions. Which, of course, if you think it through, and we've talked about this in the past in some teaching series we've done, but if you really think it through, it's just not sustainable, and it's logically inconsistent. Because if you do a deep dive on the world's religions and you really look at them, you realize that the fundamental core beliefs of each of those religious systems are actually radically different. The way they see the world, the way that we should behave, our response to all of that. If you look at it, there's actually radical differences. So to say that they're basically all the same is just logically inconsistent. But if you take a religion 101 class in any university or college, this is essentially what the general theme of the course will be. All religions are essentially the same. And so as a culture, we take this idea of ideological pluralism in like mother's milk. We just assume it to be true. And I get that. And I get part of the posture behind it. And the reason behind it is because of this idea that religions are fighting a lot. And we want to avoid that. We want different world beliefs to get along. And I would certainly support that. I think the Bible would certainly support that. Okay, that is that if people come from a different faith background, you love them, you care for them. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. God loves everybody, right? We wouldn't hold that to be true. But to say that they're all essentially the same or equally true is another thing altogether. And so anybody who comes up with an absolute truth claim, anyone who speaks Jesus courageously in our culture, could face some sort of rejection. Now, you probably won't get beaten. You probably won't get thrown into jail. I mean, we're a culture that is religiously tolerant. But some people might not treat you with respect. Some people might not take you seriously. You might get left out. You might be the one who doesn't get invited to the party. Let me tell you, pastors don't get invited to a lot of parties. We sure can throw them, let me tell you. It might cost you a friendship. It might cost you a promotion. And people might talk about you behind your back. So there are different kinds of suffering, and there are different degrees of suffering that you may experience as a result of speaking Jesus courageously. It's just the reality. But if you take the gospel seriously, and you believe it, and you believe that it's a gift for people, well, you're going to speak it. And there's going to be risks involved in doing that. You know, nobody likes suffering. We all try to avoid suffering. Our culture doesn't handle suffering very well. And part of the reason is we don't see a lot of suffering in our culture compared to other places in the world or compared to other times throughout human history. So we can hide suffering. We can medicate suffering. We can delay suffering. And our first response to any form of opposition or difficulty or suffering is typically to get away from it, to run away from it and hide. But nowhere does it say in Scripture that we are to speak Jesus courageously only if we know there will be a positive outcome. It does not say that anywhere. Or that people will accept it. Or that it'll be in vogue or popular. We are just simply to speak Jesus courageously, full stop. And the result is not our job. Actually, it's God's job. Because the thing is, you can't change human hearts. I can't change human hearts. Only God can do that. And Paul knew that there would be consequences to speaking Jesus courageously. And so Paul risks suffering. First of all, because he knew that this is where Jesus wanted him to go, and so he's going to follow Jesus with glad delight. But second of all, he knew that if he went, his suffering could ultimately lead to lives being changed and shaped and transformed by the gospel forever. And as it turns out, that's exactly what Jesus did. And Paul was just simply following in the way of Jesus. Because what did Jesus do? Jesus left heaven. He left the Father's side. He came and he dwelt among us, fully embracing the limitations and the difficulties and the hardships of humanity. Jesus was crushed in the birthing canal. Jesus screamed for his mother's milk. He scraped his knees. He hit his thumb with a hammer. He felt hunger and thirst. He wept at his friend's funeral. He was mocked, he was beaten, and he was hung on a cross. But he went through all of that because there was a greater purpose involved in what he was doing. He was willing to endure hardship in order to see the world rescued and restored. So I want us to consider this morning. Have you ever considered that facing opposition, rather than running from opposition, is precisely where Jesus wants you to be? It may be where he wants you. Now here's the second discovery, is that speaking Jesus courageously could inspire other people to speak. I mean, Paul inspired others to speak Jesus courageously, and when people saw the Lord at work through him and saw what God was doing in all of that, it inspired them to do the same. I want us to think back of all those pictures that we saw at the beginning. Think about all those people: Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Winston Churchill, the Tank Man. All of them, through simple acts of courage, inspired movements of people to do the same. Each of them displayed courage. Each of them inspired courage. Courage encourages courage. You know, it was the philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke from the 1700s who made this well-known statement that is often quoted these days. He said this, he said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Doing nothing is easy. Doing something starts revolutions. And here's what I've discovered, church. When people stop speaking Jesus courageously, more people stop speaking Jesus courageously. And churches die when people stop speaking Jesus courageously. But when people start speaking Jesus courageously, more people start speaking Jesus courageously. And the church thrives when people start speaking Jesus courageously. Here's the third discovery. Speaking Jesus courageously could change lives for eternity. You know, it's interesting in the text that Paul said that the gospel was advancing. He said that the imperial guard was hearing the good news. And he said that the church was speaking Jesus courageously. But the question is did it have any effect? I mean, how did people respond? Were any lives changed as a result of this communication going out? Well, we find a little clue at the end of Paul's letters to the Philippians. It's in the conclusion, and it's almost hidden. You might not notice it unless you're paying attention. But I want to read that. Philippians chapter 4, verse 21, his concluding remarks. He says, "Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household." The term saint was a term that was used to describe believers in Christ. We're the holy ones. It comes from that. So anyone who is a follower of Jesus is a saint. Who did Paul include with the saints? Who were those who had responded to and accepted the gospel? He says, those of Caesar's household. You know, the Greek word for household is oikos. And in that day, the household didn't mean family members. The household meant all those people who were living in the household, all those people who were part of this extended type of a household. And in that day, many people had servants and many slaves. I mean, 75% of Rome was slaves. The other 25% were not. There were a lot there, okay? So what Paul is saying is his slaves, his servants, his soldiers, the gardeners, the cooks, the housekeepers, many of them had become followers of Jesus. And so the gospel of Jesus Christ was changing lives in bedrooms, in kitchens, in dining rooms, and in hallways. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we don't know what impact those people would have had on the entire Roman population. What we do know is that at about this time, there were perhaps 77,000 Christians throughout the Roman world. But by AD 350, there were something like 6 million. That's 56% of the population of Rome by that time had become followers of Jesus. So something was happening. Something was stirring. The gospel was advancing throughout the Roman Empire for many different reasons. And I think we should never underestimate the influence of nannies and housekeepers and gardeners when they speak the gospel courageously. You know, the actor Stephen Baldwin, he's the brother of Alec Baldwin. He was in Backdraft, and he had a number of other movies, and producer, actor, writer. This is Stephen Baldwin. He came to Jesus through his children's nanny. His children's nanny was named Augusta, and she was from Brazil. And Augusta would sing songs to his children every single night. And Stephen didn't speak Portuguese, but the songs were sung in Portuguese. But Stephen's wife, Kenya, was also Brazilian, and she spoke Portuguese. Well, one day, Kenya told Stephen, "Do you know what she's singing about to our children? Every single song that she sings about is about Jesus." And Stephen thought, well, we should have a conversation with her about that. So they had a conversation with Augusta. And they asked her the question. They said, "Augusta, why is it that you sing about Jesus in every song to our children? Couldn't you maybe sing about something else?" And they were startled by Augusta's response, because Augusta kind of laughed, and she says, "You know, what's interesting is that you think I'm here to take care of your children and to clean your house, but that's not actually why I'm here." She said to them, "You know, before I came here and I accepted the job, I went to my pastor and I went to my church, and we prayed about me taking on this job with the Baldwins. And as we prayed, there was a prophecy in the church that if I came and I worked for you, you both would become followers of Jesus, and you both would be in full-time ministry." And of course, Stephen says at that time when he heard that, he just thought, this is absolutely ridiculous that she would even assume this. I mean, he was at the height of his career. He's making lots of money. And so he's like, yeah, whatever. Okay, she's crazy. And so he just went back to work. But while he was working, his wife, Kenya, and Augusta were spending a lot of time together. And eventually, Kenya came to see Jesus for who he was. And she received him into her life. And she was baptized, and she became a follower of Jesus. And so Stephen came home, and she told Stephen all about this. She says, "You know, I've accepted Christ into my life as my Lord and Savior. I've been baptized, and I'm just asking you, would you please support me in my decision?" And Stephen said, "Sure, I will support you." But Stephen had nothing, he didn't want anything to do with it, and he went on doing his life as it was. But he was watching his wife. And he noticed how early in the morning she was so dedicated. She would get up and she would read her Bibles, and she would fall to her knees and she would pray. And we began to notice all these changes in who she was and her character, how she became transformed and more loving and more caring. And he took notice of that. And then September 11th happened, 9/11. And the world was rocked. And Stephen was rocked. And he had a lot of questions about the world in which he was living in. And so as a result of observing Kenya and Augusta and hearing about Jesus, he began to investigate Christianity. And the more he began to investigate, he saw it to be true. And he received Christ into his own life as a result of that. How did Stephen Baldwin come to know Jesus? His household nanny, the oikos, was speaking Jesus courageously. Now, you might be here today, and you might have doubts about whether or not God can use you. And the truth is that God delights in using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And if you don't think you have what it takes, I just encourage you to read the Bible and look at it from cover to cover, from beginning to end. I like what Rick Warren writes in his book, The Purpose-Driven Life. I just want to read it for you this morning. Here's what he says. He says, Abraham was old. Jacob was insecure. Leah was unattractive. Joseph was abused. Moses stuttered. Gideon was poor. Samson was codependent. Rahab was immoral. David had an affair and all kinds of family problems. Elijah was suicidal. Jeremiah was depressed. Jonah was reluctant. Naomi was a widow. John the Baptist was eccentric, to say the least. Peter was impulsive and hot-tempered. Martha worried a lot. The Samaritan woman had several failed marriages. Zacchaeus was unpopular. Thomas had doubts. Paul had poor health, and Timothy was timid. And that is quite a variety of misfits. But God used each of them in his service. And he will use you too if you stop making excuses. Quite a thing. And it brings to mind what the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Corinth, a church that who were chasing after super pastors and platform builders. And here's what he said to them. He says, "For consider your calling, brothers. You know what? Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." God delights to use average Joes and everyday Josephines to turn the world upside down, and God delights in using you. And so, Crosspoint, may we speak Jesus courageously. May we do it winsomely. May we do it lovingly. May we do it through relationship. May we do it trusting in God's goodness and power. And may the gospel advance. May we inspire others to be courageous. And may lives be transformed for all eternity, no matter what the cost. I want to give you an opportunity this morning to respond to the message. At the end of our time together, we're going to try something a little bit different. We're calling it a bit of an experiment for the month of February, so welcome. You get to be the guinea pigs in the experiment. Instead of closing with a song, we're going to give you an opportunity for reflective prayer. And it's only going to last a couple of minutes. So maybe you're here and God has nudged your heart in some way, and you just need to address it. Maybe you need to do business with God. Or maybe you're here today, and as a result of this conversation, you're starting to think, yeah, there are people in my life that I really want to know Christ. Or maybe you're here today, and you realize that you need to find peace with God. And you maybe need to receive Christ in your life for the first time from hearing this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to play some music quietly, and we're going to give you about 2 minutes to pray. And then I'm going to step down, and then after that, I'm just going to step up, and I'm just going to commission us to go from here this morning. Now, there might be some of you here this morning who need specific prayer. And we're going to continue that this morning as well. And I want to encourage you to come while we're doing this to come for our altar prayer, is what we would call it. We have a team of people every Sunday who are here over to your right, my left, who will be sitting there and who would love to pray for you in your need. You know, one of the things we've observed about altar prayer is that, and we've even heard this, is that some are afraid to respond because there's a bit of a stigma attached to altar prayer. You know, you don't want to be that person who has to go up and have prayer, because the stigma is, if you need to go for prayer, well, there must be something really wrong with you. Let me just say to all of us this morning and declare it, there's something really wrong with all of us. So can we just give each other permission to receive prayer? We don't know why people need prayer. There's health, there's family, there's the need to receive Christ. There's so many things that we do, and we all need prayer. And we just want to come alongside and pray with you, whatever your need is this morning. And so while we're having our time of reflective prayer, if you need prayer, come on forward. I'm actually going to be down praying during altar prayer as well, and I'll be there to be among our team there to pray with you and for you. But if you need it, come and receive prayer. But let's take a couple of minutes just to pray together and respond to God's word this morning.